javelins, freelancers, ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another report from Anthem Universe. I am but one of your hosts, Ogaz, and today we're going to take a look at gear and builds. Now, in particular, in the last week, you would note some information that's been shared and discussed from the stream last Friday. And I've been spending the last week thinking about what kind of video would make sense here. And I really thought that there's two conversations here, and I want to make sure both are addressed. The first one is related to the people that are familiar with loot, gear, and progression in a lot of the games. So whether you play Destiny, Division, Diablo, or perhaps other MMOs, you'd have some idea about what this progression is about. The second, though, is the single-player campaign players that are jumping into Anthem, and you know what? Maybe you guys don't give a rat's about gear. So I guess I wanted to address that for a moment. The idea, of course, is that's the best part of this game so far from what we can tell, is that you don't have to play that game. If you don't want to build, if you don't want to min-max, if you don't want to create the greatest, most awesome, ridiculously powerful javelin you've ever seen and take on Grandmaster level 3, you don't have to. So I guess the pressure's off, hopefully, for some of you. So first of all, we're going to talk about conversations that we'll share across both of those spectrums, whether you're a gear fan or whether you're not, and then hopefully be able to shape where you want to go in Anthem when it drops in February, not far away. Now, what I want to do is do a quick TLDR. So if you don't want to watch a 20-minute video, I get it, I hear you. Let's give the top level view, take this away, do what you will, and go from there. Right? So the first things first, customization versus personalization. So customization relates to the gear and the gear that bears impact on the performance in the world. So any modifications or gear that you put onto your javelin that actually affect and adversely, positively or negatively your gameplay in the real world, these are part of the customization. Okay, so there's no cosmetics in that conversation there. The second one is personalization. So personalization, as we know it, is the elements of cosmetics and visual aesthetic that modifies the visuals of your character. Okay, so that could be armor, it could be the paint color, it could be vinyls, etc. So this all contributes to your personalization. Just note there, as I said armor a moment ago, armor doesn't have some magical characteristic. So you can add elements to that armor, which we'll talk about, but by itself, it is considered a personalization item. It is not something that has physical properties itself. Number two, you have a pilot level. Okay, so weapons will drop at your pilot level, not at your javelin level. Okay, so your exosuit out in the real world does not level, your pilot, your freelancer does, and loot that you receive will drop relative to the level of your pilot. 3, weapons, right, 2 weapons, 3 gear slots, 6 components. So what that means is you've got basically 11 variables that you've got in play. 2 different weapon types that you can pick. Colossus has the advantage of being able to pick everything, which is awesome, including the heavies. But apart from that, everyone has 2 weapon slots, 3 gear slots that affect different parts of the game for you in terms of your performance and output, and of course lastly 6 components. Now components can be loaded on the gear in order to modify those characteristics. Okay, so we'll talk a lot about that later on. Number 4, gear score. Now there is a gear score. Now that gear score is defined by the total sum of the gear you hold. Now that's cool, and I'll tell you why, because in the earlier days, earlier this year at least, the conversation was going to be that gear score favored towards the most powerful weapon you had in your kit, and that comes with its challenges. So I was very excited to hear that the gear score is a summary of all the gear that you currently have in terms of the levels of the gear you hold. Number 5, inscriptions. Inscriptions are fused onto a weapon, okay? So you can't modify these, but each weapon comes up with up to 4 different inscriptions on them. Consider them as variable characteristics that affect a weapon. So a certain weapon might have more ability with fire rate, or with greater ammo capacity, etc. But we'll talk about those later. Number 6, blueprints. There are blueprints in the game, so you can craft if you wish, and you can use materials that you gather from the world to craft your own weapons. Number 7, components. Now, as I said earlier, components add stats to your gear. There's 6 of those. Cool. 8, effects. There are status effects and detonator effects. So these effects will actually form part of your combo, and we'll talk about that later on as well. 9, your gear javelin tiers look like this in terms of gear and javelins. You've got common, uncommon, rare, epic, masterworks, and legendary. So those are the confirmed tiers of different weapons that you might find out in the world, and of course ultimately then what your javelin becomes as you gear it up. Lastly, pilot levels, Lancer, Freelancer, Master, Grandmaster 1, 2, and 3. Now what I mean by that is these are actually difficulty levels that you select. So for example, if you go on a mission or an exercise, you could pick the master difficulty, you would face a higher caliber of enemy, but of course would then also qualify for a higher tier of loot. At the beginning of the game, you will have access to Lancer, Freelancer, and Master, and as you unlock and progress through the game, you will eventually get access to Grandmaster 1, 2, and 3, which sounds scary as hell, but we'll see how we go. Okay, that's all. That's the TLDR. Now, let's get on to the real meat and potatoes, huh? As we said earlier, customization and personalization, we've got that down pat. I think we understand that. The interesting part that extends from that is the weapons and loadout. So as I mentioned before, there's 2 weapons, 3 gear, 6 components, right? So that allows you to have variations. Now, of course, the gear slots are also unique to the javelins. So for example, the Colossus has 3 types of gear slots, so does the Ranger, but those 3 gear slots are actually slightly different in configuration based on that suit. If you go with Colossus, for example, you would have an ordnance launcher, for example, in one gear slot, a heavy assault launcher in another gear slot, and then some support gear material in the third. Right. In addition to that, you've got 2 weapons, of course, that I mentioned earlier, and then 6 components that can modify different parts of the equipment. Now, inscriptions. Like we mentioned earlier, inscriptions can come in a variety of up to 4 per weapon. The higher tier the weapon, the higher the inscription. Anything above uncommon, and you'll get at least 1 inscription on the weapon. They provide for various effects and bonuses, they're randomized, and there's over 100, there's a pool of over 100 inscriptions that you can get per item. So it gives you an insight into the type of things that you can access in Anthem, which is pretty bloody cool. What are some examples of inscriptions if you're not really sure what we're going with there, but it could be something like a pickup radius buff. So for example, the Storm, by the way, is apparently the greatest in terms of pickup radius, so pick Storm if that's your thing. But you could have a boost there, you could have boost in damage stats, you could have a boost in secondary utilities potentially. Now you get access to more inscriptions as you level up. Okay, so as you progress through the game, you'll get more on the weapons as you progress, and all is well. Now, one point there is you can't re-roll weapons. There's been a lot of questions about, can I re-roll? Can I do that? No, you can't re-roll a weapon. So once you've got a weapon with those inscriptions, that is it. You could deconstruct the weapon, okay, and then try and recraft it if you have materials, and then to build a new weapon, but you're essentially not re-rolling the weapon, you're actually deconstructing it. The conversations around blueprints that we had earlier, as I mentioned, you can craft, you cannot re-roll, as I said, but you can craft, you can find mats out in the world, materials out in the world, and lastly, the blueprints will scale. So if you find a blueprint at level 5, but you choose to build a weapon at level 20, you will be building a level 20 weapon, depending on whatever level your pilot is at. So that's reassuring, I think logical, but reassuring. Next, the components. So I mentioned earlier that components are important. Now these add stats to your suits. So you could argue that the components actually give the personalization side of Anthem the extra flavor. So if you're a bit weary that like your sexy new armor doesn't come with some amazing attributes, well, the best part is it doesn't matter. You can have that cool, awesome, sexy armor, but you can then combine different components to then create your ultimate build and still have your sexy armor. So I find that quite good. It actually means it's not so limiting about your capabilities, especially if you oscillate to one particular type of armor or cosmetic set. Now, if you think about components for a moment, they're all designed to tailor and customize your style. Some examples that we saw in the stream were things like an explosive expert, which basically meant you could increase percentage damage of explosions. We saw overclocked regulator, essentially where you could increase lightning and fire damage by a certain percentage. And there's an ammo buff, which of course allows a buff for specific ammo using a particular gun. So I mean, these are nothing new for people that have played these games before, but it gives you some insights into how that's going to work. There are 6 of those components you can load in, and you can sort of see now this is where the deep min-maxing guys will really play. Like, you guys are going to be running out there looking for the ideal gun, the one that you don't have to re-roll with the perfect inscriptions, and then when you've got that, going out there, find the best components to collaborate the ultimate build using all those elements. Or craft, of course, as well, as we said before. The next point about loot drops we mentioned earlier. As I said, loot drops are tiered to your difficulty. Obviously, the higher difficulty, the higher likely loot you will receive, which is, again, perhaps not new for most of you, but an important part of the gameplay. And on this point, you cannot trade or gift with other players. So I know that's a bit sad for some people. They're really hoping to jump into a 4-player group with someone else out in free play and trade. But look, to be fair, it's not really BioWare's philosophy. BioWare wants you to get out into the world. They want you to engage, play, loot, drive, build up the stats, build up the things using your tools, using your way. And I think given the PvE conversation that we have in this game and the unlikelihood, and I'm thinking it's very unlikely we're going to see PvP on this game right now. I just don't see it happening. You know, BioWare and Mark Dara on Twitter in the past have said things like maybe post-launch, possibly, but I'm really thinking after seeing these builds, and I'm sure you probably can agree with this, look at this, look at some of these builds here and some of the things I've been talking about. These are very, for a PvP environment where players are playing against players, this could be very game-breaking. You know, for example, being in like a stasis, a frozen stasis effect for like 12 seconds, that's just not cool in PvP. So I think the reality is I don't think we're going to see it. We may see something maybe post, you know, mid to late 2019, but I seriously doubt right now this is something high on the agenda. And this sort of complements that conversation. Lastly, we got some opportunity to see the masterwork and legendary items at play. Actually, I should say the legendary items actually weren't available, which kind of sucks, but we did at least get to see masterwork in play. Now, masterwork is the highest power level that we've seen. They all come with an orange masterwork property, and that's consistent across all weapons of that caliber. So as an example, the one we saw on the stream is an assault launcher gear piece, and that's with the ranger they've got this with right now. It is an upgraded version of previous weapons. It has a blast missile that when you defeat an enemy, it also engages an electric explosion. So you may want to acquire multiple versions, you know, of the assault launcher gear piece, because the inscriptions will be different. The orange masterwork property will stay the same. However, the inscriptions, like we said earlier, will vary as well. Now, we didn't see much in terms of legendary for now, but hopefully we'll see more of that very, very soon as the ultimate tier that we'll all be grinding for at some point, I have no doubt. Lastly, I just want to reflect on this Masterworks build that they provided, and it's something special. Now, if you actually look at the components that Darren's added here, you can see the 6 components I was talking about before. So he's gone with the ones Airborne Advantage, Combined Arms, Defensive Bulwark, Tip of the Spear, Assault Augment, and Grenadier Inscription. And you can see the descriptors for all those, the variables and the characteristics that they all have with this Masterworks Ranger. Whether it's a damage related, whether it's the number of enemies you're taking out, whether it's a buff, etc. So all these things obviously contribute to make your Ranger even more special. Now, the best part about all this is if you combine all the components and the weapons provided along with the inscriptions on the weapons, you can see what type of build Darren actually got to make. And if you think about it, like this is basically the build. So he hovers. Now, in hovering, he gets a reduced cooldown by half on his special abilities. So anything in his gear slot, cooldown timer is halved, and he gets better weak point damage. If he defeats an enemy with his missile, it does a bonus explosion, and it makes his grenades do 50% more damage. Now, if he uses a grenade and gets 3 people with that grenade, it regenerates his shields. If he gets 2 with it, it regenerates his ultimate skill. Now, his ultimate, as a flow-on effect, increases his gear damage by then 50% thereafter. I know that sounds like a lot, but if you combine all those elements into one build, you're basically looking at an ultimate leveraging, hovering, grenade-throwing Ranger. If you like to throw grenades, you like to hover, you like to ultimate like a beast, then this is your build, right? Now, of course, this is just one type, and this may alienate some of you, and it may be really awesome to some of you, and for some of you, it may be very indifferent. But it is interesting to look at how BioWare are starting to have these conversations. I think the best part, just like anything with these games, is A, finding out what the players will do when this is in their hands. You know, how will they break it? I hope they won't break it, but how will they create the most magical builds, and what combinations will they come up with that BioWare probably never even thought of, you know? Anyway, we'll see more from that, no doubt, in the coming weeks. Of course, we've got a stream coming up in the next day or two, so we'll take a look at that, and no doubt more to come from Anthem and Anthem Universe. I hope this video gave you a little bit of insights into where gear is right now. Again, there's 2 conversations, as I said, and I'm hoping that both the people that are familiar with gear and, of course, people that are new to the conversation can walk in and still enjoy everything that we've been talking about. Of course, if you do want to talk more about this stuff, don't forget to jump in the Discord, which is discord.anthemuniverse.com. You can, of course, follow Anthem Universe on Twitter, which is twitter.com/AnthemUniverse. And, of course, like, click, subscribe, do all those things as you do on the YouTubes. Guys, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm Ogaz, as I mentioned. This is Anthem Universe. Javelins, freelancers, we will see you next over the wall.